At my sister's wedding, my parents told me I didn't belong there, but when I vanished without a trace, they realized they had lost me forever. My name is Rachel, and for 26 years, I lived as the invisible daughter in a family that only had eyes for one star. What I'm about to tell you might sound familiar if you've ever felt like a supporting character in your own family story. Before we continue, shout out your location in the comments. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. Our community is growing, and tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. Some families operate like theater productions, where everyone knows their role except the person playing the understudy. Growing up in our colonial house on Birchwood Avenue in Millbrook, Connecticut, I learned that love was a competitive sport, and I was always coming in second place. When I brought home a report card with straight A's and one A-, my parents would scan it quickly before asking when Natalie would be home from her debate tournament. When she walked through the door hours later with news of winning first place, suddenly our dining room transformed into a celebration hall. "Look at what our accomplished daughter has achieved," my mother would beam, immediately calling my grandmother to share the news, while my report card lay forgotten on the kitchen counter. I was 9 when I first understood the hierarchy in our household. I had spent months preparing for the regional spelling bee, practicing words until I could spell them in my sleep. The day of the competition, I made it to the final round, placing second out of 200 students. Backstage afterward, I waited for my parents with a silver medal clutched in my hand and hope flooding my chest. My father appeared first, glancing at his phone with a distracted expression. "Nice job, sweetheart," he said absently. "Your sister just called from her violin recital. She played a solo piece perfectly. We should probably head over there to congratulate her." That moment taught me that excellence wasn't enough. Even achieving something remarkable would always be overshadowed by whatever Natalie was accomplishing 3 towns over at her private arts academy. The pattern became so predictable, I could have written a manual about it. When I graduated as valedictorian from Millbrook High, my parents attended the ceremony, but spent the entire time discussing Natalie's acceptance to Juilliard's pre-college program. When I received a full scholarship to the State University's honors program, their response was lukewarm compared to their excitement about Natalie's summer intensive with the Boston Symphony Youth Orchestra. I convinced myself it was because she was the eldest, the trailblazer. I told myself they were proud of me too, just in a quieter way. I created elaborate justifications for their behavior, because accepting the truth, that I was fundamentally less important to them, felt impossible to survive. By my early 20s, I had unknowingly shaped myself into the family's invisible infrastructure. I was the one who remembered anniversaries, coordinated holiday gatherings, and stayed local while Natalie built her impressive career performing in concert halls across Europe. I was dependable Rachel, always available when needed, never missed when absent. The cruelest part wasn't the neglect itself, it was how natural it had become, how completely I had accepted this role. I didn't even recognize my own resentment until much later, when everything finally shattered. For now, I simply kept trying harder, believing that eventually my dedication would earn me the recognition I desperately craved. I was wrong about many things during those years, but I'm getting ahead of myself. First, you need to understand how deeply I believed in this family, how desperately I wanted to matter to people who had already decided I was replaceable. By 18, I had perfected the art of being grateful for scraps. While Natalie headed to the New England Conservatory with grand send-off parties and family financing, I enrolled at the local state university. Not because I couldn't qualify for better schools, my grades and test scores were exceptional, but because someone needed to stay close to home. Someone needed to be available for emergencies, family events, and the countless small responsibilities that kept our household functioning smoothly. "It's so practical of you to stay local," my mother said when I announced my decision. Not proud, not excited, practical. The word felt like a participation trophy wrapped in false praise. Natalie called home twice a week from Boston, usually on Tuesday and Sunday evenings, and our entire household would reorganize around those 40-minute conversations. My parents would gather around the speakerphone in the kitchen, hanging on every word about her performances, her professors, her social life among other talented musicians. I learned to disappear during these calls, but I could still hear the warmth in their voices, a tone they reserved exclusively for her achievements. During my sophomore year, I started working part-time at the university's admissions office while maintaining a perfect GPA. I thought surely this combination of academic excellence and professional experience would earn some acknowledgement. Instead, my parents were too busy planning their trip to hear Natalie perform at Carnegie Hall to notice my Dean's List recognition. "She's doing incredibly well," my father would tell anyone who listened. "Full scholarship, performing with professional orchestras, the complete package." When people politely asked about me, he would add, "Oh, Rachel's doing fine too. She's very steady." Steady, reliable, practical. These became the words that defined me in family conversations, as if consistency was somehow less valuable than brilliance. After completing my degree, I found work at a nonprofit arts organization in Hartford, 30 minutes from home.
Close enough for Sunday dinners, close enough to handle family crises. Natalie was launching her professional career by then, performing with orchestras in major cities and earning more in a single concert than I made in 3 months. I found myself constantly defending my choices to stay local. I love this area, I would say, when people question my geographic limitations. Not everyone needs to live in a big city to find fulfillment. But the truth was more complicated. I was terrified of leaving because what if something happened and they needed me? What if my absence made me even more invisible than I already felt? The comparisons followed me everywhere. At extended family gatherings, relatives would ask about both daughters, but conversations inevitably shifted to Natalie's latest performances. "And what about you, Rachel?" they would ask as an afterthought. "Still working at that little arts place downtown?" That little arts place became my sanctuary. For 8 hours each day, I existed in a space where my contributions were valued. My supervisor appreciated my attention to detail, colleagues relied on my follow-through, and donors specifically requested to work with me. But evenings and weekends pulled me back into my assigned family role. I became the default coordinator for holiday celebrations, the one who remembered to send birthday cards, the one who checked on our aging relatives in nearby nursing homes. These responsibilities felt meaningful and necessary, but they were never acknowledged as real contributions. They were simply expected from steady, reliable, practical Rachel. What I didn't understand then was how actively I participated in my own diminishment. I had accepted the supporting role so completely that challenging it felt selfish, almost aggressive. I was about to learn that some family dynamics are so toxic they require radical action to escape. But that revelation was still months away, hidden behind layers of hope and denial that would take a wedding disaster to finally strip away. This story took hours to research and craft, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe would truly make our day. Now, let's get back to it. Everything changed when my father collapsed during his morning jog. I was 24 then, settled into my routine of work, family obligations, and the quiet hope that someday things would shift in my favor. The call came while I was reviewing grant applications at the nonprofit. My mother's voice was shaky, fragmented in a way I'd never heard before. "The paramedics think it might be his heart," she said. "Can you meet us at Hartford Hospital?" I dropped everything and drove there immediately, my mind racing through possibilities I wasn't prepared to face. When I arrived, I found my mother pacing the cardiac unit waiting room, her usual composure replaced by raw anxiety that made her look fragile and older than her 58 years old. The tests revealed a mild heart attack and dangerously high blood pressure, conditions that required immediate lifestyle changes and ongoing medical management. My father, who had always been the family's steady anchor, despite his favoritism, suddenly seemed vulnerable and overwhelmed by the new reality of medication schedules, dietary restrictions, and regular cardiology appointments. "We should call Natalie," my mother said from his hospital bed, before we even had a complete diagnosis. I had been there for 8 hours, taking detailed notes, researching treatment options on my phone, and coordinating with his medical team. But of course, we needed to consult the daughter who lived in Chicago and hadn't been home in 6 months. The video call lasted 90 minutes. Natalie, armed with her conservatory education and natural commanding presence, peppered the doctors with questions I had already asked. She demanded second opinions, researched cardiac specialists, and created recovery plans with the efficiency of someone managing a concert tour. My parents were visibly relieved to have her taking charge, even from 800 miles away. "Thank goodness we have someone who knows how to handle these situations," my father said after the call ended, his voice still weak but filled with gratitude. I sat in the corner, holding my folder of medical information and insurance forms, feeling like a secretary whose CEO had just arrived to take over the meeting. From that point forward, I became the family's unofficial healthcare coordinator. I drove my father to cardiology appointments, managed his complex medication regimen, and learned to prepare the low-sodium, heart-healthy meals his condition required. I researched insurance coverage, found specialists within our network, and created a digital tracking system for his vital signs and symptoms. Natalie called 3 times a week to check in and offer guidance from Chicago. During these calls, my parents would update him on test results and recovery progress as if I had been the one sitting in every doctor's appointment, asking the questions and implementing the care plans. She would suggest modifications to his exercise routine, most of which I had already discussed with his physical therapist. The irony was suffocating. I was managing every aspect of his recovery, but she was receiving credit for being the responsible, caring daughter who stayed involved despite her demanding performance schedule and geographic distance. My own career began to suffer as I took time off for medical appointments and family emergencies. I turned down a promotion to program director that would have required occasional travel to conferences, knowing that my parents needed someone nearby they could depend on. When my supervisor asked about my decision, I made the usual excuses about preferring work-life balance and stability. Meanwhile, Natalie's career continued to soar. She joined the Chicago Symphony as a second violin, moved to an expensive downtown apartment, and began performing with chamber music groups that toured internationally. During her brief holiday visits, she would arrive with expensive gifts and captivating stories about her musical life, entertaining my parents with tales of famous conductors and exclusive performance venues. I would watch from the kitchen, usually preparing meals or managing his medications, as they hung on every word about her glamorous world. The contrast was stark and painful. She was living an exciting, culturally significant life worthy of admiration and attention, while I was simply maintaining the daily operations that kept our family functioning. The sacrifice felt noble at the time. I told myself I was being mature and responsible, putting family needs before personal ambition. But slowly, resentment began building in places I didn't want to acknowledge. Not toward my father's illness, that wasn't anyone's fault, but toward the automatic assumption that my time, my career, my life were naturally less valuable than hers. During this period, I also became the family's emotional support system. When my father struggled with depression following his heart attack, I was the one researching therapists and driving him to appointments. When my mother developed anxiety about his condition, I was the one coordinating family meetings and managing everyone's concerns. I handled insurance disputes, coordinated with multiple specialists, and became fluent in medical terminology I never wanted to learn. My weekends were consumed by meal prep, medication organization, and researching the latest cardiac rehabilitation techniques. My social life, already limited, virtually disappeared as I channeled all my energy into keeping my father healthy and my family functioning. Looking back, I can see how desperately I was hoping this crisis would finally demonstrate my value to them. Surely managing a life-threatening health situation would prove that I was more than just steady and reliable, that I was essential. But even as I coordinated every aspect of his care, the recognition I craved remained elusive. During family gatherings, relatives would praise Natalie for staying so involved with Dad's health despite her busy career. They would mention how wonderful it was that she called so regularly and took such an interest in his recovery. When they acknowledged my role, it was always in terms of basic availability rather than skilled management. "It's so good that Rachel is nearby to help with the day-to-day things," they would say, as if driving to appointments and managing complex medical care were simple tasks that anyone could handle. The assumption that my contributions were less skilled, less important, less worthy of recognition became increasingly difficult to accept. I began working longer hours at the nonprofit to compensate for the time I was taking off for family responsibilities. I would arrive early and stay late, trying to prove my dedication to my career while managing the constant interruptions of medical emergencies and family needs. My supervisor noticed my increasing stress, but attributed it to the natural challenges of having an ill parent. What she didn't understand was that I wasn't just dealing with a family medical crisis. I was managing the entire situation while watching someone else receive credit for my work. The emotional exhaustion was overwhelming, but I convinced myself it was temporary. Once Dad recovered fully, things would return to normal, and maybe my parents would finally recognize how much I had contributed during their time of need. I was about to learn that some family patterns are so deeply entrenched that even life-threatening crises can't shake them. But first, I had to navigate the next challenge that would test my commitment to this thankless role even further. The call that would change everything was still months away, hidden behind layers of hope and medical appointments that kept me too busy to recognize how much I was sacrificing for so little recognition. What I didn't realize was that I was training my family to expect my availability and expertise without ever acknowledging either. I was teaching them that my needs would always come second to their comfort, and they were becoming increasingly comfortable with that arrangement. The call came on a Thursday evening in April, while I was preparing my father's weekly medication organizer. I had just finished researching new cardiac rehabilitation programs when my phone buzzed with Natalie's number. Unusual, since she typically called on weekends when her performance schedule was lighter. Her voice was breathless with excitement, barely containing news she was bursting to share. "I'm engaged," she announced before I could even finish saying hello. "David proposed last night after my solo performance with the chamber ensemble. The ring is absolutely stunning. 2.5 carats, emerald cut, completely perfect." I felt that familiar mixture of genuine happiness for her success and the hollow ache of being relegated once again to an audience for her triumphs. "Congratulations," I managed, and I meant it. She deserved love and happiness, even if witnessing her receive it reminded me of everything missing from my own life. "I'm calling Mom and Dad next, but I wanted to tell you first," she said, which was probably diplomatic rather than truthful, but I appreciated the gesture. "We're thinking a summer wedding, maybe August, something elegant at a vineyard or a state venue, but not too massive." As she talked about potential locations and guest lists and the 1,000 decisions that accompany wedding planning, something shifted inside me. Here was an opportunity. Maybe the opportunity I had been waiting for my entire adult life. A chance to prove my worth beyond medical appointments and medication schedules. To show my family that I could be more than just available and reliable.
"I'd love to help with the planning," I heard myself saying. "I have experience coordinating events through my work at the foundation, and since you're so busy with performances and touring, I could handle the local vendor research and coordination." "Really? That would be incredible." Her relief was audible through the phone. I was wondering how I was going to manage everything with my concert schedule. "You're so good at organizing complex projects." Finally, recognition of an actual skill I possessed. Not just availability or geographic convenience, but genuine competence. I felt a surge of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. The next few hours were a whirlwind of excitement as news spread through our extended family network. My parents were ecstatic, already discussing guest lists and venue possibilities. When my mother mentioned the complexity of planning a wedding while Natalie was traveling for performances, I volunteered again to handle the local coordination and vendor management. Rachel's offered to take on the planning logistics, my father announced, and for once I heard genuine approval in his voice. She's always been excellent at managing detailed projects. That night, I lay awake creating mental lists of everything that would need coordination: venue research, vendor interviews, budget planning, timeline development, all tasks that played directly to my professional strengths. For the first time in years, I felt like I had something valuable to contribute to my family beyond simply being present when needed. I threw myself into wedding research with an intensity that surprised even me. I created detailed spreadsheets comparing venues, compiled comprehensive vendor portfolios, and researched everything from floral designers to transportation logistics. This wasn't just event planning. This was my chance to finally step out of the shadows and demonstrate what I was truly capable of achieving. Natalie seemed genuinely grateful for my involvement, calling regularly to discuss options and seek my recommendations. My parents, too, began turning to me for updates and advice about wedding-related decisions. After years of feeling invisible, suddenly I was essential to creating the most important day of my sister's life. I took vacation days to tour venues across Connecticut and Western Massachusetts, spent weekends meeting with caterers and photographers, and devoted my evenings to creating comparison charts and timeline proposals. My social life, already limited by family caregiving responsibilities, disappeared entirely as I channeled all my energy into making Natalie's wedding absolutely perfect. The venue search consumed 3 weeks of intensive research. Natalie had specific requirements: somewhere elegant but not traditional, sophisticated but not stuffy, large enough for 200 guests but intimate enough to feel personal. She wanted outdoor ceremony space with indoor reception backup, professional-grade acoustics for the string quartet she was planning, and proximity to hotels for out-of-town guests. I toured 17 venues across 3 states, taking detailed photographs and notes, negotiating pricing packages, and creating comprehensive comparison documents for each location. When I finally found Riverside Manor in the Berkshire Hills, a restored 1920s estate with terraced gardens and a ballroom with perfect acoustics, I knew it was exactly what she had envisioned. The venue coordinator, Caroline, was impressed by my organizational approach and attention to detail. "Most families struggle to articulate their vision this clearly," she said after our initial meeting. "You've obviously put serious thought into understanding exactly what kind of celebration this should be." When I presented the venue options to Natalie and my parents via video call, their reaction was everything I had hoped for. "This is perfect," Natalie said, scrolling through the photos I had compiled. "You found exactly what I was picturing but couldn't quite describe. How did you know?" Rachel's always been intuitive about these things, my mother added, and I felt my chest swell with pride at this unexpected recognition. For once, I wasn't just steady or reliable, I was intuitive, insightful, someone who could understand and deliver on a vision that others couldn't even articulate. The vendor selection process was equally intensive. I interviewed 12 photographers, 8 caterers, 6 florists, and countless smaller vendors for everything from transportation to entertainment. Each meeting required preparation, travel, and follow-up coordination. I created detailed portfolios for each vendor category, complete with pricing breakdowns, availability calendars, and my professional assessments of their capabilities. Natalie had opinions about every choice, which she shared during our increasingly frequent phone conversations. The photographer, whose portfolio I had carefully reviewed, wasn't quite right, too traditional in their approach. The caterer I had spent hours with needed to completely revise their menu proposals, too predictable for her tastes. The florist required multiple design revisions to match her evolving vision. "I trust your judgment," she would say after rejecting another carefully researched option. "But I just know what I want, and I know you'll find the perfect fit." I did know what she wanted, because I was the one translating her long-distance preferences into reality.
meeting with vendors repeatedly to refine proposals, and managing increasingly frustrated professionals who are growing tired of constant revisions. My parents, while appreciative of my efforts, seemed to view my work as a natural extension of my caretaker role rather than the significant professional undertaking it had become. When relatives called to ask about wedding progress, they would say, "Rachel's handling all the coordination." In the same tone, they might mention that I was handling the grocery shopping. The criticism became more frequent as summer approached. The invitation design I had coordinated with a local artist wasn't quite what Natalie had envisioned. The menu tasting I had arranged included options that didn't properly reflect her dietary preferences. The timeline I had developed with the venue coordinator moved too quickly in some areas, too slowly in others. "I know you're doing your best," my mother said after a particularly tense family conference call, "but Natalie has very specific standards for her special day. Everything needs to be absolutely perfect for her." Perfect. That word had haunted my entire relationship with this family. Natalie deserved perfect because she was the accomplished one, the talented one, the daughter whose happiness mattered most. My job was to deliver perfect execution, not to be appreciated for the expertise and effort required to achieve it. 3 weeks before the wedding, I was working 12-hour days coordinating final details while maintaining my responsibilities at the nonprofit and managing my father's ongoing medical care. My supervisor had expressed concern about my increasing distraction, and my own health was suffering from the stress and sleep deprivation. But I was so close to pulling off something truly spectacular. The venue was booked, vendors were confirmed, every detail was falling into place. In just a few more weeks, I would finally have proof that I could create something beautiful and meaningful for my family. I would finally have earned the recognition I had been seeking my entire life. What I didn't understand was that no amount of perfect execution could change fundamental family dynamics that had been established over decades. I was about to learn that some people will find fault with even the most flawless efforts when they are determined to maintain existing power structures. But that devastating lesson was still weeks away, hidden behind layers of hope and exhaustion that would take a single moment of human error to finally strip away. The morning before the wedding, I woke at 4:30 a.m. with a 3-page checklist that would consume every moment until the rehearsal dinner. Final vendor confirmations, last-minute pickup runs, and coordination meetings filled my schedule from dawn until evening. I had been planning this day for weeks, but the magnitude of everything that needed to happen in the next 36 hours felt overwhelming. The ceremony was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at Riverside Manor, with cocktails on the terrace followed by dinner and dancing in the main ballroom. I had confirmed and reconfirmed every detail, created backup plans for weather contingencies, and packed 2 emergency kits that could handle everything from torn dresses to missing boutonnieres. By 11 a.m. Friday, I was running ahead of schedule. The floral arrangements had been delivered and approved by Caroline. The caterers were setting up their prep station according to plan, and even the string quartet had arrived early to test the acoustics in the ceremony space. For the first time in months, I felt like everything might actually proceed smoothly. That's when I made the mistake that would destroy everything I had worked to build. I had just picked up the final delivery from the rental company. Specialty crystal stemware that Natalie had insisted were essential to her vision, along with custom linens and hand-forged candelabras that had cost a fortune to source. The items were packed in 3 separate boxes, heavier and more awkward than I had anticipated. As I loaded everything into my car, my phone rang with an urgent call from the venue coordinator. There was a question about the timeline for transitioning from cocktails to dinner service, and she needed clarification before the catering staff could finalize their setup schedule. The conversation lasted maybe 7 minutes, but those were 7 crucial minutes of distraction while I stood next to my open trunk discussing logistics and taking notes. After ending the call, I drove directly to Riverside Manor to handle some final coordination details with the vendors. I spent the next 3 hours working with the florist to adjust centerpiece heights, reviewing sound equipment with the quartet, and ensuring every element was positioned exactly as Natalie had requested. By 6 p.m. Friday, the rehearsal was starting, and I rushed home to change clothes for the dinner. It wasn't until I was getting dressed that I realized what I had done. The 3 boxes of crystal stemware, custom linens, and candelabras were still sitting in my trunk, forgotten during that phone call hours earlier. The specialty items that were supposed to elevate the reception from beautiful to extraordinary. The handcrafted details that had taken weeks to source and cost thousands of dollars.
I sat in my bedroom, staring at my phone, trying to calculate how to explain this to my family. One moment of distraction, one oversight in months of meticulous planning, and I had potentially compromised the visual centerpiece of Natalie's reception. Every table setting would be incomplete without the crystal stemware. The custom linens were specifically chosen to complement the venue's existing decor. The candelabras were meant to create the romantic ambiance that tied together her entire aesthetic vision. The rehearsal dinner was torture. Every time someone mentioned how beautiful everything looked, how perfectly organized the wedding was going to be, I felt the weight of my mistake growing heavier in my chest. I kept searching for the right moment to confess what had happened, but the evening was filled with toasts and celebration, and I couldn't bring myself to inject crisis into the joy. I told myself I could fix it in the morning. Maybe the setup crew could incorporate the items somehow. Maybe the tables would look acceptable without the specialty pieces. Maybe no one would notice the missing elements that had seemed so crucial during months of planning. But I knew better. Natalie noticed everything, especially when it came to the vision she had spent months perfecting. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying that moment by my car, wishing I had been more careful, more focused. After months of trying to prove my competence and reliability, I had failed at the most basic level, simply remembering to deliver everything that was needed. The irony was crushing. In my desperation to be perfect, to finally earn recognition and appreciation, I had made exactly the kind of mistake that would confirm every doubt my family had ever had about trusting me with important responsibilities. I arrived at Riverside Manor at 6:30 a.m., hoping to somehow salvage the situation before anyone else discovered the problem. The rental boxes sat in my passenger seat like evidence of my incompetence, and I had spent the sleepless night creating increasingly desperate plans to incorporate the items into the existing setup. Caroline met me with a diplomatic but strained expression. She had clearly been briefed on the situation by the early setup crew who had noticed the incomplete table settings. "We can try to work some of these pieces into the arrangement," she said carefully, "but it will require adjusting the entire ballroom layout. The tables are already set, the lighting is programmed to highlight specific elements, and the floral arrangements are positioned for the current configuration." "How long would it take?" I asked. Though I already knew the answer would be problematic, 4 hours minimum, and we'd need to charge for the additional setup time and crew overtime. 4 hours that we didn't have, and additional costs that would come out of my already depleted personal budget. I stood in the beautifully decorated reception space surrounded by months of careful planning and coordination and felt everything crumbling around those 3 forgotten boxes. Natalie arrived an hour later for her final venue walkthrough, radiant with anticipation that everything would be flawless. She moved through the ceremony space with obvious approval, complimenting the floral arrangements and the seating configuration. I followed behind her, carrying the weight of my confession like a physical burden. When we reached the reception ballroom, her expression immediately shifted. "Where are the crystal stemware and candelabras?" she asked, scanning the tables with growing confusion. I took a breath and explained what had happened, watching her face transform from confusion to disbelief to fury with each word. "You forgot them," she said, her voice ice-cold with controlled anger. "After all the time we spent planning these details, after all the money we invested in creating exactly the right atmosphere, you just forgot them?"
My parents, who had been admiring the ceremony setup, hurried over when they heard the tension in her voice. Within minutes, I was explaining the situation again to three increasingly angry faces, watching years of accumulated disappointment crystallize into the single moment of failure. "This is exactly what we were afraid of," my father said, his disappointment cutting deeper than anger ever could. "We trusted you with the most important day of your sister's life, and you couldn't handle the basic responsibility of delivering what was needed." My mother's response was quieter, but somehow more devastating. She worked so hard to have everything perfect, and now her reception won't look the way she planned because you couldn't keep track of 3 boxes. "It was an accident," I said, hating how defensive I sounded. "One phone call, 7 minutes of distraction. After months of perfect coordination, I can pay for the additional setup time and crew overtime. We can still fix this." "Fix this?" Natalie's voice was sharp with disbelief. "The photographer arrives in 90 minutes. Guests start arriving in 3 hours. You think throwing money at this makes up for ruining my vision?" The argument that followed was years of accumulated resentment finally erupting into the open. Every perceived failure, every moment of falling short of expectations, every comparison to Natalie's achievements, all of it poured out in that elegantly decorated ballroom while vendors pretended not to listen to our family destroying itself. "You've always been careless with details that matter," my mother said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We should have known better than to trust you with something this important." "Maybe," my father added with devastating quietness, "it would be better if you just weren't here today. Let your sister have this day without worrying about what else might go wrong."
The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Not, "We're disappointed," or "You made a mistake," but, "Don't be here. Don't exist in this family moment. Don't contaminate this important day with your presence and incompetence." Natalie stood there in her casual clothes, already transformed in my mind into the bride who deserved better than a sister like me, and said nothing to defend me. No protest that I had worked for months to create this day. No acknowledgement that one mistake didn't erase everything I had accomplished. Just silence that felt like agreement. "Maybe you're right," I heard myself saying, surprised by the calmness in my own voice. Maybe that would be best. I walked out of Riverside Manor with my head held high and my heart completely shattered, leaving behind months of work and years of desperate hope for acceptance. As I drove home through the morning traffic, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. If they wanted me gone from this celebration, I would give them exactly what they asked for. But I wouldn't stop at just missing the wedding. I would disappear from their lives entirely, and they would finally understand what it meant to lose someone they had never properly valued in the first place. I spent the day of Natalie's wedding in my apartment, watching the live stream that a cousin had thoughtlessly tagged me in on Instagram. The venue looked spectacular, of course, even without the missing crystal and candelabras. The reception was elegant and flawless. My months of planning had created exactly the celebration Natalie had envisioned, right down to the string quartet's perfect acoustics in the ceremony space. What struck me wasn't the absent details that had caused such devastation that morning. It was how genuinely happy everyone appeared. My parents beaming with pride as they walked Natalie down the aisle together, relatives laughing and dancing during the reception, Natalie radiant in her custom gown, surrounded by the love and attention she had always commanded so effortlessly. No one looked like they were missing me. No one seemed to notice that the person who had coordinated every vendor, negotiated every contract, and managed every detail was conspicuously absent from the celebration. The family continued to function, to celebrate, to be complete without me there. That realization should have been devastating, but instead, it felt clarifying. For 26 years, I had believed I was essential to this family's happiness, that my efforts and sacrifices were the invisible foundation holding us together. Watching them celebrate so joyfully without me proved what I had never wanted to accept.
I was optional in their lives. That if I was optional to them, maybe they could be optional to me, too. The idea built slowly throughout that long day of watching other people celebrate my work, while I sat alone with takeout Chinese food. What if I took my father's cruel suggestion seriously? What if the best gift I could give this family was my permanent absence? Not just for one day, but forever. I started researching that very evening, still in my pajamas, still surrounded by wedding vendor contracts that no longer served any purpose. I looked up housing markets in cities I had never visited, job opportunities in fields I had only dreamed of exploring, legal requirements for changing your life completely when you need a fresh start. The internet is full of resources for people who want to disappear, I discovered. Not in any dramatic or illegal way, but simply to extract yourself from situations that no longer serve your well-being. There were articles about cutting toxic relationships, forums for people who had successfully relocated and reinvented themselves, practical guides for protecting your assets when you need to make a clean break from manipulative family dynamics. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations or approval. I wasn't planning this to hurt them or seek revenge. I was planning this because I finally understood that I deserved a life where I was valued, appreciated, and loved for who I was rather than what I could provide. The wedding photos appeared on social media over the following days. Beautiful, professional shots of a perfect celebration that could have graced any bridal magazine. I searched through dozens of images, looking for any sign that my absence had impacted the day's success. There was nothing. If anything, everyone looked more relaxed and genuinely happy than I had seen them in family photos for years. My phone remained silent for a full week after the wedding. No apologies for the cruel words, no requests to talk through what had happened, no acknowledgement that maybe telling me I didn't belong at my own sister's wedding had been unnecessarily harsh. The silence confirmed what I had already realized. They were perfectly content without me. 10 days after the wedding, Natalie posted a lengthy social media tribute to everyone who had made her day special. She thanked Caroline, the venue coordinator, the photographers, the musicians, the caterers, and dozens of friends and family members who had supported her. She thanked my parents for their love and guidance, David for his patience during the planning process, even her college roommate who had helped address invitations from Chicago. My name appeared nowhere in the post. Months of work, thousands of dollars from my own savings, countless hours of coordination and vendor management, and I had been completely erased from the narrative of her perfect day. When a distant relative commented, asking about the venue selection, someone replied that Carolyn had been wonderful to work with and had handled all the coordination beautifully.
That night, I made my final decision. I would disappear, but I would do it methodically, legally, and completely. If they wanted me gone, I would give them the gift of never having to deal with my inadequacy or presence again. But I would also give myself the gift of a life where my contributions actually mattered. The week after Natalie's wedding, I began the careful process of dismantling my Connecticut existence. I had always been organized, but now I channeled that skill towards something that actually served my interests, creating a future where I controlled the terms of my own life and relationships. First, I consulted with a lawyer who specialized in family conflicts and asset protection. The consultation cost $300 I could barely spare, but it was the most valuable investment I had ever made. She explained how to safeguard my finances during family disputes, how to establish complete financial independence, and most importantly, how to create legal barriers that would prevent family members from accessing my accounts or making claims on my assets. "Are you in physical danger?" she asked, reviewing the list of precautions I wanted to implement. "Not physically," I replied, "but I need to protect myself from people who will try to emotionally manipulate me into returning to a situation that's harmful to my mental health and self-worth." She nodded with the understanding of someone who had guided other clients through similar situations.
Within a week, I had new bank accounts at an institution my family had never used, a safety deposit box for important documents, and legal documentation establishing my complete financial independence from any family ties. Next, I listed my condo with a realtor who projected a quick sale in the favorable market. I had purchased it 3 years earlier with a combination of my savings and a small inheritance from my grandfather, money that my parents had encouraged me to use for something practical and stable. The equity would provide enough capital to relocate anywhere I chose and support myself during a career transition. Leaving my position at the Arts Foundation was emotionally difficult. My supervisor had noticed my distraction during the wedding planning months, but she had also witnessed my dedication over 4 years of employment. When I requested a meeting to discuss resignation, she seemed genuinely concerned about losing me. "Is this about the family stress you mentioned? Because if you need extended leave or flexible scheduling to handle personal issues, we can absolutely work something out. You're too valuable to lose over temporary family problems." For a moment, I considered telling her the complete truth, that I was planning to disappear from my family's life entirely and start over in a different city. But the fewer people who knew my plans, the better my chances of executing them successfully without interference. I've decided to pursue opportunities in a different market. I need a complete change of environment to grow both personally and professionally. She accepted my resignation with disappointment, but provided an excellent reference letter and promised positive recommendations for future opportunities. Before leaving, I quietly compiled all my portfolio materials and client testimonials into personal files, building the foundation of credentials I would need to freelance remotely or find work in a new city. The skills I had developed coordinating events and managing donor relationships were transferable to many different professional contexts. The most challenging aspect was handling shared financial obligations without alerting my family to my disappearance plans. My parents and I maintained joint accounts from my college years that had never been separated, accounts they occasionally accessed for family expenses or emergencies. Closing these required careful timing to avoid triggering immediate questions. I waited until my father was traveling for a medical conference, and my mother was busy with post-wedding thank you note obligations. Then, I withdrew my contributions to the shared accounts, leaving only their original deposits, and closed my access to joint credit cards. I transferred the funds to my new private accounts and documented everything meticulously in case there were later questions about financial impropriety. Natalie's honeymoon in Italy provided perfect cover for the final phase of my preparations. With her out of international contact and my parents focused on their normal routines, I had 2 weeks to complete the most visible changes without immediate detection. I sold my furniture to an estate sale company, keeping only what would fit in my car and a small storage unit. I canceled utilities, transferred my mail to a postal forwarding service, and arranged to vacate my condo early, forfeiting my security deposit to avoid standard notice requirements that might trigger family questions. The most emotionally difficult task was sorting through personal belongings that connected me to family memories. Photo albums, gifts from relatives, mementos from family vacation and celebrations. Items that had no monetary value but represented decades of shared experiences and relationships. I spent an entire evening going through boxes of keepsakes, deciding what to preserve, what to donate, and what to simply discard. In the end, I kept very little. A few photographs of my grandparents, some books that had influenced my thinking, and a small music box that had belonged to my grandmother before she died. Everything else felt contaminated by recent betrayals, transformed from treasured memories into reminders of relationships that never been what I believed them to be.
By the time Natalie returned from her honeymoon, I had created a completely new life infrastructure. New financial accounts, new job prospects, new housing arrangements in a city 800 miles away, even a new phone number that would make impulsive contact impossible. The condo sold 3 days after the honeymoon ended, closing faster than anyone had projected. I used the proceeds to eliminate my remaining debts, reimburse myself for wedding expenses, and create an emergency fund that would support me for 6 months in my new location. On my final day in the apartment, where I had spent so many evenings coordinating family events and managing medical care, I stood in the empty living room that had witnessed years of thankless service. The silence felt different now, not lonely, but peaceful. I was ready to discover who I could become when I wasn't constantly trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth their full attention or respect. The mountain town I chose was nothing like anywhere I had lived before. Ashford, Colorado, 3 hours west of Denver, was small enough to disappear in, but large enough to support the kind of remote consulting work I planned to pursue. I had selected it entirely through online research, which felt appropriate for this completely new version of my life. I rented a small house with views of snow-capped peaks, furnished it with basics from local shops, and set up a home office that looked nothing like the corporate environment I had left behind. The walls were painted warm colors that reflected the sunset light, and I decorated with local artwork and plants rather than the generic professional decor I had accumulated over the years. For the first month, I lived quietly, using my legal name for official documents, but introducing myself to neighbors and local business owners as Rose. Close enough to Rachel that I would respond naturally, different enough that casual internet searches wouldn't immediately locate me. The transition to consulting work proved surprisingly smooth. My portfolio attracted clients within the first few weeks, and I specialized in helping small nonprofits improve their donor engagement strategies. Work that could be completed entirely remotely and paid well enough to support my deliberately simplified mountain lifestyle. For the first time in my adult life, I had no family medical emergencies competing for my attention. No guilt about missing Sunday dinners, no crisis management calls interrupting my professional focus. I discovered that I was exceptionally good at my work when I could devote my full energy to it without family obligations constantly pulling me in different directions. The local community welcomed newcomers who contributed positively to the area's economy and culture. I joined a hiking group, started volunteering at the animal rescue, and became a regular at the Saturday farmers market. These relationships developed naturally based on shared interests and mutual respect, rather than family obligation or workplace proximity. 6 months into my new life, I realized I hadn't checked any social media in weeks. I had initially used it to monitor my family's activities from a distance, but gradually lost interest in tracking their lives. The wedding photos that had once felt like evidence of my erasure now seemed like pictures of strangers at an event I had helped coordinate but never truly belonged to. The 1 year after leaving Connecticut, I owned my house outright, had built a thriving consulting practice, and maintained savings larger than anything I had achieved while supporting family obligations. More importantly, I had learned to make decisions based on what I wanted, rather than what others expected from me. I was no longer Rachel the caretaker, Rachel the reliable one, Rachel the disappointment. I was simply Rose, learning who that person could be when given complete freedom to discover her own potential without constantly seeking approval from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. The discovery happened 18 months after I had vanished from their lives. I learned about it through social media posts that mutual friends shared, creating ripples that eventually reached even my carefully constructed new existence. My cousin posted a frantic message asking if anyone had heard from Rachel, saying my parents were desperately worried and trying to locate me. The narrative they constructed was masterful in its manipulation. I was portrayed as mentally unstable, possibly suffering from a breakdown that had caused me to abandon my loving family without explanation. My mother gave interviews claiming I had taken money from family accounts before disappearing, conveniently omitting that I had withdrawn only my own contributions. They hired a private investigator who traced my movements as far as the condo sale, but couldn't follow the trail beyond that point. The legal precautions I had taken made it impossible for them to access my financial records or discover my new location through official channels. When private investigation failed, they escalated to public manipulation campaigns designed to pressure me into returning. But I had spent 18 months building genuine relationships with people who valued my presence and contributions.
When strangers called my new community with vague warnings about my character, my friends and colleagues defended me without hesitation. The business network that had embraced me proved stronger than my family's distant manipulation attempts. 2 years after my disappearance, I learned that my parents had been telling people I had died in an accident. It was easier for them to be victims of tragedy than to examine their own behavior and acknowledge that they had driven away their own daughter through decades of emotional neglect and comparison.
I felt surprisingly little sadness about being declared dead by the people who had given me life. It seemed like an appropriate metaphor. The Rachel who had desperately sought their approval was indeed gone forever. In her place was a woman who had learned to value herself, who had built meaningful relationships based on mutual respect, who woke up each morning grateful for the life she had created rather than resentful about the life she had been assigned. My parents still live in that colonial house on Birchwood Avenue, probably wondering what they did wrong, but never understanding that the problem wasn't any single action. It was decades of making me feel like I was never quite enough. Natalie continues building her musical career, probably telling new friends she's an only child rather than explaining why her sister chose to disappear. As for me, I am exactly where I chose to be. Some people might say I was too harsh, that families should forgive and forget, that I threw away relationships over pride. But I know the difference between pride and self-preservation, between forgiveness and self-destruction. I chose myself. For the first time in my life, I chose myself. And that choice gave me everything I had been searching for in all the wrong places. Got 2 more amazing stories lined up for you. If you dug this one, you're gonna love what's next. Go ahead and click.